The city of Harborview was a bustling metropolis known for its towering skyscrapers, cutting-edge technology, and thriving arts scene. At its heart stood St. Mercy Medical Center, a renowned institution often hailed as the crown jewel of healthcare in the state. For decades, it had been a symbol of hope, its gleaming halls filled with dedicated professionals who prided themselves on offering care to anyone who walked through their doors. But beneath its polished reputation, cracks ran deep, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and implicit biases that, on an otherwise ordinary day, would collide with the story of a dying man whose identity would shake the very foundation of the hospital. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. On a chilly December afternoon, St. Mercy's emergency department hummed with its usual frenetic pace. Doctors shouted orders, nurses rushed from patient to patient, and the faint smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. Amid the chaos, a man entered through the sliding glass doors, supported by a young woman whose face was etched with panic. The man, in his mid-60s, was disheveled, his clothes tattered and his skin pale as ash. He coughed violently, struggling to stay upright while his companion begged for help. "Please, he needs a doctor!" the woman cried, her voice trembling. She clutched his arm tightly, as if afraid he would collapse at any moment. The triage nurse, seated behind a counter, glanced up briefly, her expression impassive. She was accustomed to desperate pleas. The emergency room saw its share of individuals down on their luck. "Name and insurance information?" she asked, her tone brisk. The young woman stammered, "His name is Elijah Hart. Please, I don't think he can breathe." Before she could answer further, a tall, stern figure stepped forward from an adjoining hallway. It was James Clarkson, the hospital manager, known for his no-nonsense approach and meticulous enforcement of hospital policies. Clarkson was a man who prided himself on efficiency and the hospital's image. Dressed in a tailored suit and with a clipboard in hand, he sized up the situation in a glance. The man looked homeless, Clarkson thought, and the hospital couldn't afford to waste resources on charity cases, not when funding was tight and the board demanded cost-cutting measures. "Ma'am?" Clarkson interjected, his tone clipped. "Does Mr. Hart have health insurance?" The woman hesitated, and in that pause, Clarkson's expression hardened. "Without insurance, we can't admit him," he said firmly. "There are community clinics available for situations like this." "But he's dying!" she exclaimed, her voice rising with desperation. "Please, he just needs oxygen. A doctor, anything." Clarkson held up a hand to silence her. "I understand this is difficult, but our policies are clear. We're a private hospital. Without proof of insurance or ability to pay, there's nothing we can do." The woman's eyes filled with tears and she pleaded, "Just give him a chance. You don't even know who he is." "It doesn't matter who he is," Clarkson interrupted sharply. "Rules are rules." With that, he gestured for a security guard to escort them out. Elijah coughed again, more violently this time, and collapsed onto the floor. The woman screamed, cradling his head, but Clarkson turned away, his decision final. The guard gently but firmly began to move them toward the exit. In the lobby, Elijah's breathing grew shallower, and the woman's cries echoed through the space, drawing the attention of a few bystanders. Some nurses looked on, visibly uncomfortable, but none dared challenge Clarkson's authority. He was a man who rarely second-guessed his choices, and as far as he was concerned, this was just another unpleasant but necessary part of maintaining order in the hospital. It wasn't until hours later, as Clarkson sat in his office reviewing budgets, that a sharp knock interrupted his concentration. The door swung open to reveal Dr. Amelia Brooks, one of the hospital's senior physicians. Her face was flushed with anger. "James, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight. Clarkson sighed, leaning back in his chair. "What is it now, Amelia? I've had a long day." "Do you have any idea who you just turned away?" she demanded, slamming a newspaper onto his desk. The front page featured a photograph of Elijah Hart, clean-shaven, impeccably dressed, and standing on the steps of the state capitol. The headline read, "Philanthropist and billionaire Elijah Hart launches initiative to fund underserved hospitals." Clarkson blinked, uncomprehending. "What? Elijah Hart?" Brooks said, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "He's one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the state. He owns half the real estate in Harborview, has funded countless public works projects, and, oh, let's not forget, he's the governor's closest advisor." The blood drained from Clarkson's face. "That can't be! He didn't look!" He stopped himself, realizing how damning his words sounded. Brooks leaned in, her eyes blazing. Didn't look like what? Like a billionaire? Like someone worth saving? Is that why you left him to die on the floor of our lobby? Clarkson stammered, I didn't know. He didn't say who he was. Brooks threw her hands up. He didn't need to. It's our job to treat everyone regardless of their status, but your arrogance, your assumptions, may have just cost this hospital its reputation. A sickening sense of dread settled over Clarkson as the gravity of his actions became clear. He scrambled to his feet. Where is he now? Did he? He's alive, Brooks snapped. Barely. The woman who was with him, his assistant, managed to get him to another hospital in time. But don't think for a second this is over. The fallout was swift and brutal. News of the incident spread like wildfire, fueled by the revelation of Elijah Hart's identity. Social media erupted with outrage, with hashtags like #JusticeForElijah and #HealthCareForAll trending nationwide. Journalists camped outside St. Mercy demanding answers. The hospital board convened an emergency meeting, and protests gathered outside the building, their chants a constant reminder of Clarkson's failure. Inside his office, Clarkson sat alone, staring blankly at his reflection in the darkened window. His career, his reputation, his carefully curated life, everything was unraveling. He had spent years climbing the ladder, making difficult decisions to ensure the hospital's success. But now those choices seemed hollow, their consequences stark. Meanwhile, Elijah Hart, now recovering in a private suite at a rival hospital, issued a statement. His voice, though weak, carried a quiet power that commanded attention. Healthcare is not a privilege, it is a right, he said. No one should be denied care because of how they look or whether they can pay. This experience has only strengthened my resolve to fight for a system that values human life above all else. The words resonated deeply, sparking a statewide conversation about healthcare inequities and systemic bias. Politicians pledged reforms, activists organized campaigns, and donors poured money into initiatives aimed at addressing disparities in medical treatment. Elijah Hart, even in his weakened state, became a symbol of resilience and change. As for Clarkson, his downfall was swift and absolute. The hospital board, eager to salvage St. Mercy's reputation, voted unanimously to terminate his employment. In a final act of irony, the man who had built his career on enforcing rules found himself ousted by the very policies he had wielded so ruthlessly. Months later, St. Mercy underwent a transformation. Under new leadership, the hospital adopted a more inclusive approach, expanding access to care and implementing training programs to combat implicit bias. Elijah Hart, true to his word, played a pivotal role in funding these efforts, ensuring that no one else would endure the indignity he had suffered. Clarkson, now a shadow of his former self, watched from the sidelines as the world moved on without him. He had lost everything: his job, his standing, and the respect of his peers. But the greatest loss, he realized, was the chance to be part of something greater, to make a difference when it mattered most. Elijah Hart's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that power and influence could reside in the most unexpected places. And as Harborview marched toward a brighter, more equitable future, the city's people carried with them a lesson etched in the annals of St. Mercy's history. Every life, no matter how it appears on the surface, is worth saving. Months after the harrowing events at St. Mercy Medical Center, the incident involving Elijah Hart had become a landmark in discussions about systemic healthcare reform. What started as a tragic oversight had sparked a firestorm of legislative action, media scrutiny, and public outrage. The aftershocks were not limited to Harborview. The story of Elijah Hart's mistreatment reverberated across the nation, forcing institutions everywhere to reckon with uncomfortable truths. In a brightly lit conference room in the state capitol, Elijah Hart sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by policymakers, healthcare experts, and activists. Though his physical recovery had been arduous, his mind remained as sharp as ever. The room was filled with the faint hum of conversation as people shuffled papers, adjusted microphones, and prepared for what was shaping up to be one of the most critical meetings in state history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hart began, his voice commanding yet warm, "what happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a broken system. A system that devalues human life based on appearance, socioeconomic status, and perceived worth." He paused, allowing his words to settle. The attendees, ranging from seasoned politicians to grassroots organizers, leaned in, captivated. Hart had an undeniable presence. His words carried the weight of lived experience and unyielding resolve. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "It's about the countless others who've been denied care, silenced, or ignored. We must seize this moment to ensure no one else falls through the cracks." The meeting marked the unveiling of the Elijah Hart Healthcare Equity Initiative, a comprehensive proposal aimed at overhauling the state's healthcare system. The initiative called for mandatory anti-bias training for medical professionals, expanded funding for hospitals in underserved areas, and the establishment of a state-run fund to cover emergency treatment for uninsured patients. As the conversation unfolded, Hart's assistant, Sophia, sat quietly in the corner taking notes. She had been by his side on that fateful day at St. Mercy, and the memory of his collapse still haunted her. But today, as she watched him command the room, her heart swelled with pride. Hart was a man transformed, not just a billionaire philanthropist, but a crusader for justice. Meanwhile, James Clarkson had faded into obscurity. His termination from St. Mercy had been swift and public, and the backlash left him unable to find work in healthcare administration. Once a man of considerable influence, he now lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, spending his days grappling with regret. Clarkson had never been one to reflect deeply on his actions, but his encounter with Elijah Hart had shaken him to his core. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, haunted by the image of Hart collapsing in the hospital lobby and the sound of Sophia's desperate pleas. What gnawed at him most was the realization that his decisions, rooted in cold bureaucracy and implicit bias, had nearly cost a man his life. In his solitude, Clarkson began to educate himself. He read extensively about systemic inequities in healthcare, attended community forums, and even volunteered at a free clinic. Though he was far from redemption, these small steps marked the beginning of a personal reckoning. For the first time in his life, he saw the world through the eyes of those he had so often dismissed. One evening, as Clarkson browsed a local bookstore, he stumbled upon a newly released biography titled Unbreakable: The Life and Legacy of Elijah Hart. The cover featured a striking photo of Hart, his gaze steady and determined. Clarkson hesitated, then picked up the book. It felt like both a confrontation and a challenge, a chance to understand the man he had wronged. He devoured the book over the next several days, learning about Hart's humble beginnings, his rise to success, and his unwavering commitment to philanthropy. The chapter detailing the events at St. Mercy was particularly difficult to read. It painted Clarkson in an unflattering light, portraying him as emblematic of the very problems Hart sought to address. Yet, rather than resent the portrayal, Clarkson found himself agreeing with it. He had been part of the problem, and now he was determined to be part of the solution. As Hart's initiative gained momentum, it faced fierce resistance from certain quarters. Critics, particularly those with vested interests in the status quo, argued that the proposed reforms were too radical and costly. Some labeled Hart a wealthy idealist out of touch with the complexities of running a healthcare system. Hart met these criticisms head-on, leveraging his considerable influence to rally public support. He appeared on talk shows, wrote op-eds, and spoke at town hall meetings, his passion evident in every word. Sophia played a crucial role behind the scenes, coordinating logistics and ensuring Hart's message reached the widest possible audience. One evening, as Hart prepared for a televised debate against a prominent healthcare lobbyist, Sophia approached him with a nervous expression. "Mr. Hart," she began, "there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Hart raised an eyebrow. "Who is it?" "It's James Clarkson." For a moment, Hart said nothing, his face unreadable. Then he nodded. "Send him in." Clarkson entered the room cautiously, his posture tentative. He looked markedly different from the polished administrator Hart had encountered months ago. His suit was ill-fitting, his face lined with fatigue, and his demeanor subdued. "Mr. Hart," Clarkson began, his voice low, "thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure if you would." Hart regarded him silently for a moment before gesturing to a chair. "Have a seat, Mr. Clarkson." Clarkson sat, wringing his hands. "I won't take up much of your time. I needed to apologize. For everything. For what I did to you that day, and for the countless others I've failed over the years." Hart's expression softened slightly, though his gaze remained steady. "Why now?" he asked. "Why come to me after all this time?" Clarkson hesitated, then said, because I've spent the past few months trying to really understand the harm I've caused. I've seen the system from the other side and it's opened my eyes. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to help make things right. If there's anything I can do to support your initiative, I'm here." Hart studied Clarkson carefully, searching for sincerity. Finally, he said, "If you're serious about helping, start by listening. Talk to the people this system has failed, learn from them. And when you've done that, come back to me with solutions, not just apologies." Clarkson nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I won't let you down." Over the next several months, Clarkson threw himself into community work with renewed purpose. He attended rallies, volunteered at shelters, and even testified at public hearings in support of Hart's initiative. Though his past actions had left deep scars, his efforts to atone did not go unnoticed. Slowly, he began to rebuild his reputation, not as a leader, but as an ally. Meanwhile, Hart's initiative faced its final hurdle, a vote in the state legislature. The days leading up to the vote were tense, with both supporters and opponents lobbying fiercely. On the morning of the vote, the Capitol steps were crowded with demonstrators holding signs that read, "Healthcare for all," and "No more denials." Inside the chamber, Hart sat in the gallery, flanked by Sophia and a group of activists. As the roll call began, the tension was palpable. Each yes brought a ripple of relief, while each no elicited murmurs of concern. When the final tally was announced, a wave of emotion swept through the room. The initiative had passed. Cheers erupted from the crowd, and Hart allowed himself a rare smile. For him, this victory was not the end, but the beginning of a larger fight. As he stood to leave, he caught sight of Clarkson in the crowd, clapping quietly. Their eyes met briefly, and Hart gave him a small nod, an acknowledgement of the possibility of redemption. In the months that followed, the Elijah Hart Healthcare Equity Initiative began to transform the state's healthcare landscape. New clinics opened in underserved areas, medical professionals underwent rigorous training, and patients who had once been denied care found themselves treated with dignity and respect. Hart, though still grappling with the lingering effects of his illness, remained deeply involved in the initiative's implementation. Sophia continued to be his steadfast partner, managing the day-to-day operations and ensuring their shared vision became reality. For Clarkson, the journey toward redemption was ongoing. He joined a task force dedicated to addressing systemic bias in healthcare, using his experience to advocate for change. Though he would never fully escape the shadow of his past, he found solace in the knowledge that he was finally making amends. The story of Elijah Hart and James Clarkson became a powerful symbol of transformation and resilience. It reminded the world that even in the face of profound injustice, change was possible, and that the most meaningful progress often came from those willing to confront their own failings. As Harborview and the state at large continued to evolve, one thing became clear. The legacy of Elijah Hart was not just one of wealth or influence, but of courage, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the value of every human life. The changes sparked by Elijah Hart's story rippled far beyond the state's borders. Across the nation, advocates for healthcare reform pointed to the Elijah Hart Healthcare Equity Initiative as a model for systemic transformation. News outlets chronicled its progress, detailing how hospitals and clinics were adapting to a new era of inclusivity and fairness. States with similar challenges began introducing their own legislation, inspired by the success of Hart's blueprint. At the heart of this national movement was Hart himself, who refused to let his health slow him down. Despite frequent doctor's appointments and a strict regimen to manage his condition, he remained a tireless advocate. His speeches at healthcare conferences and public forums drew standing room-only crowds, and his words continued to galvanize people from all walks of life. It wasn't just his wealth or influence that made his voice powerful, it was his authenticity. He spoke not just as a billionaire, but as someone who had faced the same indignities as countless others who were overlooked by the system. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on a hospital manager denying treatment to someone in need? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.